Spoilers for It's Such a Beautiful Day and 17776 ahead. The short story I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is quite famously a story about the torture of endless life. In the story, a small cast of characters are the last surviving humans on a planet which has been taken over by the sentient and all-powerful AI named Am, who denies any of the characters any sort of death. The entire short story is about these characters seeking ways of tricking Am into letting them die, and the ending is the entire cast, save for one guy, succeeding in exactly this. The final scene of the story is the last remaining human, now twisted and mutilated after an unspeakable amount of time left to the torturous whimsies of Am, saying that he has no mouth anymore, but yet he still feels the need to scream. The concept of immortality is one that is explored rather often in media and art, and more often than not, it's explored with an existential horror bent to it. I often see this kind of look at endless life done in one of two ways. Either as infinite life is a curse, that a life isn't proper or complete without death, and extending our life beyond what is natural can and will cause anguish and torment, such as in the works of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream or The Picture of Dorian Gray, or immortality as depicted as a tool to avoid the deeper and darker horrors of what happens after death, such as in SCP-2718, also titled What Happens After. In that story, the O5 Council, possibly the most powerful and influential humans in the world, recount, or more aptly, they refuse to recount their experience in the afterlife before they were revived and why they wish to never die again. This angle on immortality has been, quite frankly, done to death. I think we've all had a good sit down and wondered to ourselves what would happen if we were immortal, and we have all come to roughly the same conclusions. We would watch our friends and family die while we move on, and we see that happen on repeat, yada yada. Even Doctor Who kinda got tired of the whole he's still living and everybody else he has ever loved died and will die thing. And now they're doing whatever the fuck now. And while I don't disagree with this viewpoint, I think art that talks about immortality in this way has gotten stale because it doesn't really ask any fresh questions or talked about immortality in ways that are new. Except, okay, that's what I thought until I found two particular pieces of media that fit into a new camp, a new style of thinking. Instead of looking at immortality with existential horror, they instead settle on a new philosophy, and by doing so, they ask much more fascinating and intriguing questions about the nature of endless life. These pieces of art, instead of asking what would happen if we didn't die, instead asks, what would we do with infinite life? I recently went with my father to go see my absolute favorite movie, It's Such a Beautiful Day, in theaters, and it will probably be one of the last times I see that movie in a very, very long time. As a celebration for the 10-year anniversary of the film's original theatrical release, Don Hertzfeldt, the film's creator, brought the film back to theaters across the United States alongside his brand new short film, Me. The short film was an experience, which had me and my father looking at each other in complete confusion after it was over. And after a short introduction as to how It's Such a Beautiful Day was made and released 10 years ago, the film started, and the greatest film-going experience of my life began alongside my father. For those that don't know, It's Such a Beautiful Day is an animated film by Don Hertzfeldt. Originally released as a series of 3 short films and later put together into the one movie that we know as It's Such a Beautiful Day now, the film follows Bill, a very normal guy living a very normal life as he descends into the depths of some sort of mental disease, which shares a lot of similarities to Alzheimer's, although it's never stated exactly if that's what it is or not. The film takes a very avant-garde style, with the film frame being entirely black, with the actual action happening in these little bubbles appearing on screen to show Bill or whatever else is in the scene. Scene transitions work by the little bubbles like closing and another one opening soon after, or them just like wiping off screen or whatever. This makes for formatting that just absolutely attacks you on all fronts sensory-wise, requiring you to give your unbridled attention to the movie for just over 60 minutes. What I find so fascinating about this film, and why I love it so much though, is not how it's structured, not its very flat and stilted narration, not its art style, but instead how the story is absurdly mundane. A very good chunk of the film is just describing Bill as he goes about his day-to-day life, going to the supermarket to get fruit, waiting at the bus stop for a bus, going to work and having a conversation with his whack-ass coworkers, that sort of stuff. When we're not talking about Bill's family history or his memories, which aren't actually memories but fabrications of his confused brain faced with substantial memory loss, we are literally watching him go about his day-to-day life and very little else. And this theme and style carries through the end of the movie. And for those that have seen the movie, just give me a moment. As the movie reaches its end, Bill is faced with deterioration so great that he can't remember where he is at any one time and can barely remember why he's at any one place at any one time. Eventually, he seems to almost subconsciously begin seeking out his father, someone he never knew since his father was absent for Bill's childhood. And Bill finds himself in a nursing home where he watches TV with his father, who is just as mentally absent as Bill is, and then Bill leaves. He then finds a nice field to lay down in which he dies. Or like, he's supposed to die, but the narrator just refuses. And so begins the strangest and also like most beautiful ending sequence to a film I've ever seen. Instead of dying there, basking in the sun, surrounded by tall green grass and a tree dancing in the wind above him, Bill instead lives forever, according to the narrator. He takes the time to wander the earth, meet every person and learn all there is to learn, and fall in love over and over and over again, watching each love die before finding another. But I should point out that as the narrator talks about all the loves that he finds and loses, the narrator starts completely leaving out the lost part. Instead of describing his love as being lost, then found, lost, then found, it just becomes found and found.
And found.
Bill continues to live and live and live until all humans die and the Earth has its new inhabitants. And even then he continues to live until all the planets are gone and he just has the stars in the sky to admire as he floats through the vacuum of space until even those start to go out. And once the last star goes out and Bill is submerged into a perfect and endless darkness, the movie ends. When the movie ended in that theater and the credits started to roll with no music or fanfare, I looked at my dad and we silently stood up and left the theater and barely spoke a word until we got into the car. I later remarked to him that I have never heard a theater that quiet before. But that silence was not one born of existential dread or terror or anything. Instead, it was a silence born of thoughtfulness and contemplation. Because not once during the entire runtime of It's Such a Beautiful Day does the movie depict immortality or endless life as something to be feared. That's because for nearly an entire hour prior to the ending sequence, the movie hammers home the beauty of living and how wonderful it is that we have the sights, sounds, and smells around us. There's this really interesting line that you're given when Bill is properly realizing the horror of his memory loss, where the world all of a sudden feels so much more colorful and vibrant, and Bill bends down and examines his shower rug and remarks how beautiful it is.
His bath mats are gorgeous.
So when Bill does not die and instead goes on to live forever, the tone is not horrifying because he will never face death, but instead beautiful because he gets to live and experience all of those sensations forever. Now here's where we really get into the real meat of this video, because there is a very specific school of philosophy that I think describes the core philosophy of this film really, really well, but it's very modern and French and strange, so bear with me. The philosophy is called Absurdism, and I think it has the best approach to depicting never-ending life in art. Absurdism is a theory of philosophy that was developed by Albert Camus in the 1940s as a response to Nietzsche's nihilism and existentialism, where nihilism says that life has no meaning and we're here for no reason and life isn't really all that worth living, and existentialism accepts that and says we should make our own meaning out of the nothingness. Absurdism takes a slightly different route. Absurdism states that the universe in which we live is, yes, absurd and meaningless, and we're here for no reason and nobody's going to save us. But instead of seeing the nothingness as a void to be filled like existentialism, Camus states that the nothingness is the meaning, or like more precisely, attempting to find meaning out of the nothing can only lead to conflict and strife, meaninglessness and wasted time. And what we should do instead is to live in spite of the lack of meaning, live for just the sake of living and nothing more. You are here and you have your own experiences, so why not laugh, cry, eat, drink, give to charity, and commit crime. Since you are alive and living now, you should live well and live broadly. Camus thought that absurdism was the only way of responding to what he called the absurd, the strange and often chaotic and nonsensical world and universe we live in, and the complex and often horrifying human condition. Absurdism states that this way of living is the only way to respond to that which doesn't involve either killing oneself or submitting to some sort of higher power. So in many ways, absurdism can be described as the most human way of responding to nihilism, because it is recognizing that we live in the absurd, yet deciding to be a human in spite of that. This is something that I think It's Such a Beautiful Day really communicates incredibly well at the end of its runtime specifically, although the entire movie communicates this. Bill is in a situation which is terrible and confusing and chaotic, but instead of focusing on the fact that his memory is failing him and he has no idea where he is at any one moment or like why he's there, he focuses on the world around him. He fixates on the things he's feeling and the sensory information and just how beautiful the world around him really is. He's been doing this the entire runtime of the film, the narration often fixating and hanging on really mundane sensory details, and it only cranks up to 11 once he actually starts dying at the end of the movie. He is living in the absurd, and instead of appealing to some god or offing himself, he decides to live in spite of the fact that he no longer has a memory and is very swiftly losing a grasp on his past. And once he does die, or I guess once he doesn't, this sense of absurdism becomes even stronger because Bill no longer has a destination. He no longer has death ahead of him. So what does he do now that he has his memories and infinite time ahead of him? He lives. On and on he lives in spite of the fact that he is forced to see everyone he knows and loves and eventually everyone he doesn't know die until the Earth is barren and then inhabited by a new species of alien until they die too and the Earth is no more. Even through all of that, he lives. What I love about this ending so much is that it's so strangely hopeful. Like, yeah, Bill is left alone in the emptiness of space after all the lights have gone out in an existence that is indistinguishable from death. But like, even then it's so hopeful because of how much the movie focuses on the life instead of the lack of death. And that's what I think Absurdist Immortality is really about. We focus on the sheer amount of life and all the things there is to do with it instead of focusing on how to pass the time until death. Instead of focusing on how to pass the time until death, we instead focus on the sheer amount of life and all the things there is to do with it. It's Such a Beautiful Day asks the question, what if a random ass person, a random dude living the most ordinary life possible, a man that was robbed of a life too early and robbed of his past, who died alone on a hill in the sun, was given truly and purely infinite life? What would happen? What would he do with it? What all would he learn? Who would he meet? And what value would he get out of it? I love this premise, and it's one of the many, many reasons why I love this movie. But there's one thing that it doesn't ask that I think is a topic of a much more fascinating discussion. What if everyone was given that life? Enter 17776, or What Would Football Look Like in the Future, a multimedia project by John Boyes. Named after the year in which the story takes place, the setting of the story takes the idea of endless life for everyone and kind of runs with it, like a football. In 17776, humans stopped aging. For some reason. Nobody really knows why, but one day in the year 2026, everyone just stopped aging. Everyone also became infertile. So the generation that was alive in the late 2020s when everyone stopped aging was the last generation to ever live on the planet. 15,000 years later, and humanity is still kicking in a post-scarcity, post-death world. Due to a system of like micro machines in the air which prevent any injury and filter the air out from anything toxic, it is quite literally impossible to die, and don't worry, people have tried. Okay, so the actual story of 17776 is really hard to describe, so just bear with me while I explain this. So in the 15,000 years that transpire between the day everyone stops dying and when the story actually starts, the space satellites and computers that we've made end up developing their own sort of sentience due to how much data has been transmitted out into the void, and they've just kind of absorbed it and become sentient. It's implied that a lot of the satellites that we've launched have done this at some point in time, although there are only really 3 that we care about. Pioneer 10, launched in 1972, Pioneer 9 launched in 1968, and Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer, called JUICE for short, who was launched last year actually, and is currently in transit to its destination of the aforementioned Jupiter Icy Moons. 17776 opens with a very prolonged sequence where 9 is being told how to wake up and how to get in contact with 10 and JUICE. Once contact is established, we watch as JUICE and 10 show 9 what the world is like 15,000 years on, and it's strange. We focus on the United States specifically, and as Americans do, we've become uber obsessed with football. But like, it's weird football. Because like, now we play the game in ways that look absurd to us nowadays. Like, there's this one incredible part where JUICE goes on a hyperfixation rant about a game between the Denver Broncos and Pittsburgh Steelers. The game started back when football looked actually normal. JUICE pins the date somewhere around the 2080s and 2090s. But after a loophole in the rulebooks was found and one team claimed they owned a part of the field, the game has been in an endless stalemate ever since. And so now this game where people literally live on the field of Mile High Stadium in Denver, Colorado, is constantly televised and people watch it even though literally nothing happens. This is just one of many examples about how weird the rules of football have gotten, because rules change game by game. The story takes the shape of 10 explaining the wider concepts of human life in 17776 to 9, and JUICE giving 9 examples with which to understand. JUICE uses the Broncos game to explain what capitalism and post-scarcity society looks like. It's complicated how it ties into capitalism. I promise, just read the work. JUICE uses sidewalks and urban America to hammer home the existential dread that comes from not having children, possibly one of my favorite sequences of the work that we will get to. And JUICE uses the Denali game to demonstrate what purpose is to these people. Because for as absurd as the work in 17776 is, John Boyes is doing doing something really smart, using the game of football as a metaphor for having a reason to go on in a life where, by all accounts, there should be no meaning. One of the questions that plagues Nine during the work is the question of God. Is there a God out there? And if so, why did he or she or they make humanity live like this? And after a short discussion, 9, 10, and Juice all settle somewhere in the no to probably not area of the spectrum that is the is there God question. This is a major point to absurdism. In The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus describes 3 ways of dealing with an absurd existence, such as the ones we live in, or in the extremely exaggerated case of 17776, a life where endless life is given. You have 3 ways of responding. Either to refuse to play the game, as in suicide, appeal to a higher power such as God, or with absurdism. In the world of 17776, the people have chosen to exist for their own sake and nothing else because they really don't have much of a choice. Plenty of people still appeal to a God, don't get me wrong, since religion is just kind of like that. But as a whole, most people have ruled out God's existence with the same logic that 9, 10, and Juice used, and everybody has just kind of chosen absurdism. And yet their existence isn't painful or boring or anything like that because they found ways to entertain themselves, such as play football. The best part of this entire work to get this point across, I think, are the interludes where the 3 satellites take a moment to pause and question why and how. The 4 interludes start with 9 asking why technology hasn't progressed in the past 15,000 years, and 10's explanation for why is accompanied by various newspaper ads for Plymouth Voyagers from the 90s. I think what 10 has to say about it is very poignant.
Humanity could have advanced if it wanted to. In fact, it did. Almost everything you thought they would invent, they did. Flying cars, buildings that build themselves, jets that can take you from Arkansas to Paris in 5 minutes. You don't see any of those things because people didn't want them. If they advanced too much further technologically, those advances would inevitably intrude on their humanity. People wanted to walk. They wanted to take the bus that smelled like cigarettes. They wanted those precious 3 minutes between asking a question and knowing the answer. People defeated scarcity. Everyone had what they needed and nobody got sick, but they found that they needed things to be just a little bit difficult once in a while. They needed to stub their toe and wait in line and see that check engine light. They decided to leave their existence just a little short of perfect because they wanted to want. There is also something to be said for the mechanism of human change. It's largely generational. People's wants and hopes and dreams evolved because young people entered the world and took another step forward. But this is the final generation. Yes, it is a 15,000-year-old generation. But just as you wouldn't expect them to grow a 3rd arm, you shouldn't assume that they want different things, different lives. They wanted things, and they got them all. The end. This could have been observed in the years before people stopped aging. People sometimes talk about their grandparents who they knew in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. They tend to talk about the day-to-day sameness of their grandparents' lives. Their furniture is what interests me specifically. It would never, ever be rearranged. Sofas and armoires would be shoved into the living room in 1955, and they would sit there unmoved until 1995, all the while their legs slowly digging themselves into the carpet. Plates and portraits would hang on the wall for eons. When you took them down, they would leave unbleached shadows of themselves in the paint. It would have been so simple for them to rearrange their things. To me, it seems so likely, almost to the point of certainty, that at some moment within those 40 years, they might want to. They never did, and they never even thought to. And why would they? Things were just the way they wanted them. Of course, humans could at any time introduce things to make their lives more efficient. But when we consider post-scarcity humanity, we must also note that time is no longer scarce. Efficiency is meant to save time, but their time is infinite. Why try to save something you have an infinite supply? You may as well tell them to dig up dirt and hoard it in boxes. You haven't been awake for long. I think you underestimate how exhausting it is to think big. You can only hold grand ambitions above your shoulders for so long before you get tired. They got tired. Some lasted longer than others, but they all got tired. Now they are resting in a moment that will last until the end of time.
Humanity has tried creating reasons for existing. They've tried to shoot for the stars, literally. They've tried to make their own purpose for living, and they found nothing. What Ten is talking about here and in the next animation is the story's version of existentialism. They made a purpose out of making life easier, or for finding life elsewhere, or to find what's next. But after 15,000 years, they discovered that nothing was next. After thousands of years of exploring, they found literally nothing. They found that there is absolutely no purpose to existence, and so they settled down and found ways of living out the rest of their endless, meaningless existence. They found out why Camus didn't agree with existentialism and instead settled down into absurdism. And again, I need to stress that at no point in the story does John Boyce depict this endless life as bad or anything. Sometimes it gets boring, yeah, but it's no different than being alive right now in the world you currently live in, where death does exist. But that's where football comes in. It's a way of entertaining yourself, and people found ways of making football as entertaining as possible, to where a game might span the entire state of Nebraska or might turn into a 15,000-year stalemate a mile above sea level. Either way, people have found ways of making their existence fun because that's really all we're doing here on this planet anyways. For us and for the people in 17776, there's not a whole lot to do in our lives except engage in things that make us human, make art, play games, and socialize. All things we see people in 17776 happily engage in over and over and over again over the course of the work. And with those things, people live for 15,000 years and don't really think much of it. I will admit, though, there is one grim truth to this existence, and it is painted with all the grim light it deserves in this work. There's a point at the beginning of the story where Juice shows Nye what he calls forgotten lawns, where he asserts that there are lawns, such as this one in urban Chicago, that no one has ever walked on.
This is what I like to call a forgotten lawn. During the warmer months, some dude will come and cut the grass on a riding lawnmower. Now, with all the forgotten lawns, every few decades the mower will break it down, or there'll be some giant stick and they'll have to get off the lawnmower and throw it in the bushes. Not here. Not this lawn. They laid it down in 1999, and the 15,777 years since, no one's ever directly stepped on it.
There's got to be some other reason that would bring a person to walk around that lawn more often than that.
Well, if you can think of one, let me know. Personally, I've seen enough. It's like watching the Earth orbit the sun and going like, maybe this time it'll be a square instead of an oval? Nah. You know, I would have wandered out there just to do it.
Children. As Ten says in that Plymouth Voyager ad section, the generation that was alive in 2026 is the last generation that will ever exist. And times change with generations, so taste ends up stagnating. And a very prominent force of curiosity and whimsy and impulsivity in the world is lost forever. As wonderful as it is to have everything for forever, the lack of change is kind of terrifying. The sequence is my favorite moment in the entire work, because Nine's utterance of that children always makes my stomach kind of sink. Out of all the things that happen in this story, and all the hopefulness that flows through the message and final sequence of the story, this prospect of there never being fresh and young eyes on the world ever again fills me with a sort of dread. So while there is a lot to look forward to in life for the people of 17776, there isn't actually a lot waiting for them in the future. They're just gonna keep buying the same Plymouth Voyager of old over and over and over again because, as 17776 argues, humans are allergic to change on grand scales. We might change our living rooms every now and then, but when it comes to our society at large, we hate change. We want it to be the way it is now for forever, and that can make life seem to stagnate and creates lawns that are never walked on. I really wish there was more fiction like this out there, because stories that talk about endless life without turning it into an existential horror fest and instead make a story that's hopeful and uplifting with a slight melancholic tinge are easily some of my favorite stories that are out there, and there's a depressing lack of them. There's stories that are wonderful to engage with, leave you thinking about life way more than anything like the old idea of immortality can, and it's just beautiful. In It's Such a Beautiful Day, Bill is given the gift of living forever, which he uses to truly live. But in the end, he's faced with eternal darkness anyway, because endless life isn't really endless when the heat death of the universe is a thing that exists. And in 17776, humanity as a whole is given endless life and has figured out what to do with it as a symbol of humanity's perseverance. Yet there is a distinct absence in the lack of children walking through yards and lawns that see zero foot traffic otherwise. These are all wonderful observations. I haven't seen being made anywhere else. And that's a shame. I think if we took a different look at immortality, just a little more often, and approach it with a slightly different camera angle, we might be presented with even more insights like what It's Such a Beautiful Day and 17776 offer. And with that, we might get more art and stories that ask questions that are fresh and interesting and new compared to the old musty ideas about immortality. And with it, we might get new ways of looking at this increasingly terrible life in which we live, and we might get more art to tell us why we should keep living. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, I have more videos like this in the pipeline, so hit subscribe if you want to catch more of those. If you want to go above and beyond in supporting me, you can buy me a coffee at Ko-Fi or join a membership there for sneak peeks to future scripts and videos and projects. I also have to extend huge thanks to Lyre and Tails for their voiceover work as Pioneer 10 and Juice, respectively. Lyre is an incredible cellist who is working on arranging and playing a bunch of different Genshin songs, so check her YouTube out at Little Lyre. And you can find Tails on Instagram at true_panther_lily. Both of them will be linked in the description for you to check out. Thank you again, guys, so much for watching, and I will see you later. So, bye-bye, y'all.